Welcome to the Investment Property Geeks of Charlotte. I'm your host, Chris Claflin.
And co-host Jesse Mancuso.
And today is our very first episode, which I'm super excited about. And we're going to be talking about what the heck is property management anyway. Whether you're doing it on your own or you're hiring professionals like us, we're going to give you a little bit of an overview of what to expect here the next few episodes.
Yeah, and hopefully this will offer some insight that you maybe have thought about in the past, but never really considered how property management would impact you with your investment properties.
Awesome. All right. So, hey, let's start, Jesse, by just telling folks a little bit more about who we are. So if you could tell me, let's start with you. It's so funny. I have to say, so every podcast I've ever listened to, they're like, man, show one sucked. And then we just finally got better. And so here already, we're looking at our outline. I've botched the very first item on the outline.
Right out of the gate.
Where I'm supposed to get introduced by Jesse. But we're just going to roll with the punches. And so Jesse, can you tell me a little bit more about you, your family, and your background?
Absolutely. So as you know, but the rest of the world does not, I have been in the greater Charlotte area here now for the better part of 4 years. I am originally from Pennsylvania, born and raised in Scranton, as we are well aware. Any fans of The Office out there? I have an extensive career in corporate America, but have come to real estate, I don't want to say late in life, but let's just call it later in life after several years working for some large Fortune 500 companies as a project admin and a relationship manager. I found my true calling in real estate. My family has a little bit of background in real estate up north. So for me, it's just always been something that's out there. So in the past several years, I slowly transitioned from a full-time corporate America individual into someone who is now a full-time real estate professional. Have a background in economics, so I'm again appropriately being called a geek here, I suppose. So
Yep.
Numbers interest me, but really more than anything, helping individuals, and it's really rewarding. Walking someone through renting out a home, selling a home, buying a home. So it's just been a great experience so far, and I'm the business development manager here with Sun & Property Management. So I am the guy that you're speaking to if you are interested in bringing a property on board with us.
Awesome. Cool. Well, hey, so just to emphasize how fitting the show name is, and maybe let our audience get to know you a little bit better, can you tell us a story that highlights just how much of a geek or nerd you are?
Yeah, what kind of a geek? Yeah, and we actually went back and forth on the name. I'm considering myself a nerd more than I'm considering myself a geek, but be that as it may.
I think just the fact that you're arguing the fact
right there it is. Maybe you wanted an example. There's your example. How is Jesse a geek? Well, he's splitting hairs over geek versus nerd, but I guess the best way I would put it is if there's an action adventure movie or a documentary about a presidential election that happened in the 1800s, on a Saturday evening, I'm choosing the latter. So I'm a huge history buff, especially American history. So it's always been a passion of mine. And if I was doing life all over again, I'd probably be a history professor somewhere.
Wow. Okay. All right. Maybe that's your retirement call.
Yeah, there you go. There. Once we wrap things up in real estate, I can potentially be a social studies teacher or a history professor. But enough about me and my background in geekdom. Chris, tell us a little bit more about you.
Sure. Yeah. So moved to Charlotte here about, back in 2017. Originally from Idaho. Usually when I meet people are like, wow, you're the first person I've ever met from Iowa, huh? And I'm like, no, Idaho,
close.
Different state completely. But let's see. So I've got a family of wonderful wife and 3 young boys. And I got started similar to Jesse, actually, big corporate background in aerospace. There's a very large airplane manufacturer in Washington State, shall remain nameless, that I worked in a lot of different positions for: finance, operations, program management, and in 2011 got started investing in real estate. And really, my whole real estate path kind of started before that, because when I was in college, I remember like the whole impetus for this was the very first place I started paying rent. Like first year lived in the dorms, and then second year I went out on my own and got this apartment with a friend. And I remember like they had this back in the days of the rent box, right? So like you go put your check in the rent box, and then like every week or every month the landlord would come by, and like he was a nice guy, but he was not the sharpest tool in the shed. And I just remember thinking like, wow, so this guy just like walks. This is what I thought was involved in property management back then, just to tell you how naive I am. So like the guy just walks to the box once a month, picks up all this money, and then goes home. And like he had a decent place, you know, in town and that kind of thing. I'm like, I got to learn more about this. So for the next several years, I just was reading everything I could, you know, Rich Dad, Poor Dad, which is, if you're a real estate investor, you're listening to this, almost every real estate investor's read that book. All of a sudden that gave me all sorts of great ideas. And then finally I worked up the courage and, quite frankly, the ability to convince my wife to let us in 2011 start investing in real estate. And I decided to manage on my own because quite frankly, I didn't trust any property managers. I'd met a few, and I wanted to learn how to do it. And then you know, several years later, fast forward, and kind of here we are. So yeah, that's kind of my background. I'm also, you know, minored in statistics. I mean, super nerdy. I do this,
or geeky.
Yeah, super geeky. Yeah, exactly. I'll share a quick story. Well, it may not be quick, and it's multi-part, but it will hopefully it provides some comic relief. So in 2013, my wife and I had taken this trip to Europe. We did like the whole backpack across Europe thing. And, you know, we took the train for a lot of it. And so I remember we were in somewhere, this all happened in Germany for some reason or another, but we were somewhere in rural Germany, and we were like, the train was coming to a stop. You know, we had our backpacks on, and I'm like getting ready to go through the passageway between the two trains. And I'm kind of waiting in line there. And then there are some folks in front of me, and then definitely like some people behind me. And the train comes to the stop, and I'm just standing there, and like the door opens, and all of a sudden I hear this, and I kid you not, this like 3/8 inch glass. I was standing like right in the path of the doorway that was open. Ooh. And this 3/8 inch glass just comes and whack, smacks me right in the temple on the side of my head, and like pins my head up against the door, and my arms and my backpack are in the back, and I'm like flailing my arms like this, and Amy is just laughing up a storm, like not a care in the world, and everyone's just like, oh my gosh, what's happening? And then the thing opens, I mean, lights went black, you know, for a second. Wow. I was just like, what? And then I just felt like the biggest nerd ever. I was like, I can't believe I just did that. And so it was super embarrassing, but it was just funny. And then like, you know, headache, you know, for a little while after. And then it's like this. So this is where it just gets ridiculous. So then a week or so later, I'm getting off of a train, and like I'm down on the platform, and my backpack got like stuck on the train door. So I'm like trying to get out, and a nun had to help me like get the backpack off, which was very nice of her. But the king of this was, we were going into Frankfurt on one of the nicest trains we had taken, this high-speed train. And I got to go to the bathroom. So I get up, I go to the bathroom, and the bathroom's like right by the main side entrance to the train. And there are like all these people lined up waiting to get out. So I go into the bathroom, and it's all in German. And instead of in the US where you've got these symbols, right, it's all German. And so to me, I go to lock the door, and I'm like, okay, red means locked and green means open. Mm-hmm. Not in Germany. Green means open, red means locked. Oh. So I'm like in the bathroom, all of a sudden, door opens, huge. It's like a handicap stall too. So it's like this 3/4 panoramic view of me exposed to everyone in Frankfurt coming onto the train and getting off. And it was probably like 20 people. And so anyway, so that's my super embarrassing train story from Europe. And not very many people know that about me until now.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, now everybody knows.
Now
that,
everyone knows.
Yeah. Well, there you have it, folks. Chris is a geek or a nerd because he struggles with trains, and I watch documentaries about trains.
Yep.
So
I think we've firmly established that. So kind of back to what we said, back on topic, meanwhile, back on the farm, we're really doing this to help folks who are, hardcore investors to newbie investors or people who are just on the fence about renting out their property. And we get all those folks. We talk to those folks all the time. And really, we want you guys to be more successful, kind of whatever path you choose to take. And at first it's like, man, a bunch of property managers talking about what does property management even mean. The reason we're talking about this, because we get this question all the time, like
daily.
Most people just don't realize what that means. And I kind of get it. Back to in college, like I didn't really know what it meant either. I thought you pick up the check and you're done.
Right.
Yeah. So, really we feel like this is going to be applicable whether you hire someone else to do it or, kind of like me starting out, you're doing it on your own and you just want to make sure you do a good job. And really, like we said before, certainly money is made when you decide what to buy the property for and when to buy it, but really it's really made or lost in the day-to-day management decisions you make
Absolutely.
About the property.
Absolutely. Yeah. And to piggyback on that, Chris, I think if us having this conversation and doing this podcast helps an individual, you don't know what you don't know. And oftentimes you'll have a question or you think you need to ask a question with property management, but you don't quite know what that question should be. That's what we're going to really discuss, all elements and facets of property management. So it gives you a baseline of knowledge. I tried to articulate that at the beginning, but what the heck? It's our first episode. So it's,
Perfect. So really today we're just going to kind of give you an overview of what we're going to be talking about on like the next, I think it's 11 or so episodes. Why could we not make it 10 or an even dozen? I don't know, but 11, it's a prime number. So there you go. That's what we're going to go with. I don't know why 11. So anyway, the idea is we're just going to kind of give you a little bit of a tease on each of these high level topics. And then we're going to get into like the meat and potatoes of each one on a follow on episode. And I think hopefully by the end of that, folks who are listening will have a much better idea of the things that you ought to be doing on a regular basis to make sure that you're really getting the most value you can out of your property, protecting the value of your property and protecting your cash flow. All right. So without further ado,
Or do.
I don't know.
Either way.
Without further ado. All right. So the first piece we have is property evaluation and guidance and kind of setting the strategy for your property. Do you want to start, Jesse, or do you want me to start?
No, I'm happy to take a stab at this.
Okay.
So in terms of your evaluation when it comes to your property, what we're looking for and what we're going to ask you is, what's your vision? What are you intending to do with the property? What's your long-term plan? What are you thinking about doing with the property over the long term? Rent. We're going to talk a little bit about what you actually could rent your property for. Comparatively speaking, the rental market for a rental property, I find, is very similar to comps on a house. The neighborhood is going to give you a sense of what your home actually could rent for, along with how your house compares with a very similar house right down the street. So the improvements that are going to be needed to go into that property, this is kind of all part of the evaluation process that I do when I meet with clients personally. Curb appeal. Curb appeal is so big in real estate. That's one of the first things you hear about is how nice does a house look? Well, yeah, that applies for selling and buying, of course, but it very much applies to renting. And we're going to talk about why in some greater details with the type of tenants we're hoping to attract for your property.
Can I stop you for a second?
Oh, please.
So maybe you can kind of help me, like let's just give folks an idea, since this is kind of like evaluating a property and like the future plan for the property. When you go meet with someone out at their house, how might it steer the conversation as far as like, hey, my plan is X or my plan is Y for the property? So like if you've got someone who they're relocating and they're thinking that, we get this a lot, like, hey, I'm relocating and I just bought the house last year, and so I don't think it makes a lot of sense to sell. That's one type of strategy that person might have.
Absolutely.
Versus like an investor who intentionally is buying the house and they want to hang on to it for 10 or 15 years. How might that change the things that you guys talk about together to kind of come up with what the strategy for the property ought to be or what things they do?
Yeah, great question. And you're 100% correct. That's something that's coming up quite frequently now, especially with the uncertainty and the mass migration of individuals we're seeing over these past several weeks and months related to COVID. The biggest thing is determining how much investment they have into the home at that point in time. You gave the example, someone just bought a house last year. So, they don't really have a lot of equity into the home. If they sell it right now, more than likely, they're going to lose money on that property.
Mm-hmm.
If they have the ability to maintain that as an investment property, move out of town, have someone else pay their mortgage for them while they're maintaining an investment that is growing, hopefully daily in equity, that's going to potentially be a better option for them. Conversely, if someone is cash strapped, it's not an opportunity for them to keep the house. We certainly want to talk through those examples too. That's, maybe more so someone who has had the property for several years, just cannot commit to upkeeping it. We're going to kind of really, evaluate where the individual is. That's pretty much what I do when I meet with these different types of investors.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the horizon really matters, because we'll tell folks different things like, well, so if you're planning on selling this in another couple of years when hopefully the price appreciates or whatever, then let's do X, Y, and Z, but let's not do A, B, C.
Right.
And versus if it's an investor, we might say, hey, proactively, you might want to take care of ABC right now because you're going to have this for a long term, and now's the opportune time to take care of it or knock it out. So it really does matter to some degree. Also, we get a lot of questions about where to invest in Charlotte, what types of properties are the best. So we can talk a little bit more about that when we dive into this, and that'll be kind of exciting. There's going to be a lot of it depends probably in this episode, I think. But it'll be cool because I promise what I'll give you guys are some pretty easy metrics to come up with and some easy math to do that should answer pretty much every question of, should I do X? So whenever it comes to your property, you're looking at hey, should I keep the countertops the same or should I upgrade them to granite? I'll give you a quick little easy formula that'll help you make that decision every single time. Or same, should I keep the floors, the cheap vinyl that's in here now and get a couple more years out of it, or should I upgrade it to LVP or something like that? So we'll go through that, and I'm kind of excited for that because I found that to be a very simple way to look at it. And we'll kind of share that with you, what that metric is. So.
Yeah, and if I can add to that, the evaluation piece for me, the question I always ask anyone is, how is a tenant going to feel walking into your home? This is kind of a teaser for a follow-up conversation that we'll have, but it's always important to market your property, whether you're keeping it for a short or a long-term investment, appropriately. And doing so is basically putting yourself in the shoes of someone who's going to walk in your home. Would you want to live there? Would you want to rent there? So that's one of the first things I look for with these evaluations.
Awesome. Great. All right. On to marketing your property for rent. So obviously a big important piece of what you're doing, probably not one of the harder pieces we do, but I think it's a little bit of that's because we have a system down.
Right.
Certainly we find a lot of DIY folks that don't unfortunately do a good enough job of this. So I think we have a lot of tips and tricks and pretty simple ideas here, anywhere from how you take the photos to the different things that you ought to be doing now that, we're well into the 21st century here, where you should be marketing, when should you market the property, how far in advance of when you want a tenant moving in there do you typically need to market the property. How about this? How many prospects should you expect to have on a property before you lease it? I will give you a clue right now. One of my biggest failures as a do-it-yourself investor was that I was not patient enough, and I did not have enough prospects and applicants for my property. So we'll tell you how many we expect to see on a property before we get it leased, and I'm telling you right now, the number's probably going to blow your mind. It's a lot more than I did as an investor, and that's probably why when I was an investor, I put some people in my homes that didn't work out, unfortunately.
Right.
And then a couple other things that we see all the time too are, there are a lot of, fair housing things that are easy to violate just by trying to do the right thing. Like
Right.
there are certain things, like for example, if you say, hey, just around the corner from your local YMCA, that's actually a fair housing violation, believe it or not.
Right.
Because now you're showing a potential preference for, according to the government, you're showing a potential preference for folks who are affiliated with the Young Men's Christian Association or Christians. So what if someone isn't a Christian? Now you're potentially violating a protected class. And it's
Right.
crazy to think about, but that's the world we live in. And those are the things you got to be thinking about if you're a property owner, because you don't want to get a fine
Yeah.
or someone sue you even if you deny someone, right? They could turn
Exactly.
around and they could sue you, say, hey, it's a fair housing violation.
Yeah. So with that, sometimes you have the best of intentions. You're trying to do an accurate property description. And, in point of order, it is actually right down the road from the YMCA. However, to Chris's point, you can't mention that.
Yeah.
We have to be very careful in terms of how we're mentioning that. So,
and that's not the only thing. I mean, there's a lot more that
so
goes
many
into
more.
that. And also we'll talk later about, screening. Obviously there are some legal landmines to avoid there too, but we'll talk about all that. So marketing for rent, I think folks will find some really practical applications if they're doing it on their own on exactly how you should be doing that. And we're also going to talk about like how to show property, which is kind of, interesting. We'll talk about that in general, and then we'll try to elaborate a little bit here based on what's going on with the coronavirus and the pandemic in what we see there. But we'll talk about how to show property too. After that, Jesse, what do we got on the table here?
risk mitigation.
Ooh.
Doesn't that sound fun and exciting?
I just can't wait to talk about risk mitigation.
Anytime we're talking about that, it's going to be a rip-roaring good time over here. So the most important thing is having the proper insurance for your property, making sure that your property is covered no matter what. And that's going to include both you as the owner / landlord, having the appropriate insurance. That's going to ensure that the renters are actually properly insured, not letting anyone move into a property without rental insurance up to a certain amount. We can get into that.
Yeah, and that's another area too where we find a lot of not just do-it-yourself investors, but especially if you've never done this before, you don't even know that's something you should be doing, or you might have an idea, but you have no idea where to start. But a lot of property management companies, like, I don't know about you, but every time I rented, it said I have to have renter's insurance. I have never owned myself a renter's insurance policy as a tenant. Like none of my landlords ever made me actually get it.
Oh, wow.
Whereas we have a process for how we make sure that folks can't move in without one. And then we get notified if there ever is a change, so they can't like buy it and then cancel it. Otherwise it's, so there's a system that you can put in place, even if you're managing property on your own, to make sure that doesn't happen. And you hope nothing ever will, but that's why it's there, right? So that's a really important piece. So we'll share that tip with you too.
See, that's interesting that you and I had polar opposite experiences, because anytime I would rent, that was one of the requirements. I had to provide proof that I was indeed covered. So,
well, I was supposed to also, but I never did.
I wasn't allowed to move in without it. So they're speaking to the point of, variety in property management.
Maybe
right
that's
there.
because you grew up like on the East Coast, where on the West Coast it's like way more lax.
Yeah,
I don't know.
Because they just don't care out there.
Yeah,
Is that
we
what it
just
is?
yeah
Wow.
we it's a Wild West, man. They called that for a reason.
I guess so.
All right. So also inspections, like I shouldn't say inspections. I should say evaluations or walkthroughs, because what we do is not really an inspection. That's what a
Technically.
qualified, certified inspector does. But you should be doing some sort of routine, regular visual walkthrough of your property, and there are several reasons for that. This is when you hear the term lazy landlord, and when we walk into situations where there's been damage to the property, because we get the question all the time, like, I'm really worried about a tenant moving in and destroying my property. Yeah, I get that. But most of those stories, when you kind of peel back the layers of the onion, you find the property management company or the owner, they weren't doing inspections.
Right.
Like they weren't checking in on the property. And there's a way to not do an inspection to like really offend the tenant and make it a huge headache. And then we'll give you some tips and tricks too on how we set them up for our tenants, because our tenants actually, not all of them, but most of them actually look forward to the inspection. Like they see it as a benefit, and because it is.
Sure.
And so we'll kind of talk you through how to tee up that inspection for the tenant, how to set the expectation right out the get-go. And what we actually find is we have tenants that call in now and we tell them we do these and they go, oh, how often you come by? And then we tell them and they're like, and what are you looking for exactly? And then we tell them and they're like, okay, never mind, click and hang up. And it's like, wow, dodge that bullet.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Because if you're not doing anything wrong, you have nothing to hide. I mean, you should want to work with someone in that case just to prove, hey, we are indeed holding up our end of the bargain as tenants in this property.
Yeah. And the kind of the cool thing about, I almost hate the word inspection, but the cool thing about it is what we'll talk about in this is there is that piece, but if you're doing the screening and everything right and the tenant selection and the advertising, the inspections really aren't about playing cops, like being the bad guy with the tenant. It's really about looking after the property and seeing what you can do for the tenant to truly help them.
Exactly.
And so that's kind of how we approach it.
Which leads into our next point, preventative maintenance.
Yeah.
Exactly. Getting out there, trying to identify something before it becomes an issue and jumping all over it. And in my evaluation so far, even though I've only been doing this a little while, you see a lot of things that, hey, if we start taking care of this now, yes, it's going to be an expense to you, but it is a much less of an expense today than it could be 1, 3, or 5 years from now.
So Jesse, what would you say of all the different properties you go to? What would be one of the easy but very overlooked preventative maintenance that folks just forget to do or don't realize or decided to ignore?
It's kind of interesting, and I'm seeing this, and I'm wondering if it's because we're here in the South with the humidity and the large amount of rain. Anyone with a back deck. A deck is one of those things that you spend time on, and if you're living in a property yourself, you don't know that or notice that normal wear and tear that happens, the discoloration, the wood starting to warp, so on and so forth. So keeping, especially lumber, keeping a deck pressure washed, having it stained or professionally painted to preserve that deck. I see that time and time again. You'll have a beautiful home, and then you walk in the backyard, and the deck is just you're like, where am I? How is this even happening? So it's a simple fix, but that's something I would tell almost everyone. Keep your deck clean and painted.
Awesome.
Or stained.
Yeah. So we'll give you a few more too from personal experience. I mean, kind of the cool thing about what I'm excited to share are just things that I didn't know when I was a DIY investor. Because even if you have a handful of properties, you've only experienced that handful of things. Your experience is only X properties times how many years you've done it.
Right.
Versus with a company, like you have so many properties, you get to see all these different crazy things that can happen to a property. And while each individual thing, there's maybe a small chance that it could happen, when you compile all that, the cumulative effect, like there's a pretty decent chance like, hey, I'm going to experience at some point something from one of these really awful categories at some point. So there are some really I'll give you some tips on like what you should make sure you're having done to your HVAC on a regular basis that we see will cost folks thousands of dollars, something you can do for dozens or hundreds of dollars there. And then we have a couple others too that we highly recommend folks do. Again, simple, easy things to do, but also easy not to do. And so I think that'll be really cool to give folks some insight there.
Absolutely.
All right. And then next, we'll be talking about like tenant screening and selection here. And I'm hoping we might be able to get a guest on for this, someone who helps us with this here. But what are some of the things, do you think, Jesse, around tenant screening and selection we should be chatting about?
Well, we kind of touched upon that already, and you just teed it up inadvertently. Just looking out for red flags in terms of what the tenant would potentially be bringing to the property. We're looking for someone. As a property manager, your goal, your objective, of course, is to maintain the property on behalf of the owner, on behalf of the landlord. So we're looking for professionals or I don't want to say professional tenants. That doesn't exist, although it might.
Well, it does. They're the ones that like know all the laws and they move in, withhold money, and then file an appeal with every eviction.
Right.
Those are the professional.
Yeah,
tenants.
we want to avoid those. Let's put it this way: we're looking for professional individuals rather who are going to come in and again maintain the value of your home for you. Chris, I know we talked about this before. Finding a good tenant in many ways could have they could take better care of the property than some homeowners.
Yeah, we actually see that a lot. In fact, that's one of the biggest pieces of pushback that we get sometimes from owners is like, hey, I'm not looking to sell this thing. Why do we have to make it so nice? And it's like, well, I know you're not looking to sell it. That's why you got to make it nice, because the people we want to move in here, they expect nice. And if you want crummy tenants, have a crummy property. If you want great tenants, have a great property.
Right.
Like attracts like. And so there are some things like that's what's so interesting about this is that when it comes to tenant screening and selection, the process doesn't start where you think it does.
Right.
It doesn't start with an application.
Mm-hmm.
It starts way before that. And so we can give you some tricks and tips on that as well. All right, what else? I see fair housing.
Yeah,
on here.
we kind of already teed this one up inadvertently as well. You'll notice fair housing is going to be very important. Anyone who's becoming familiar with real estate will learn all about fair housing. But it is important that, a property is being marketed appropriately. We are in compliance, not in violation of anything related to fair housing. So, yeah, we'll have some helpful things to consider and to look out for, just so that, as mentioned before, you might have the best of intentions, but yet you're doing something inadvertently that's against the law.
Yeah, and one great example, something that unfortunately is not unfortunately, I got to be careful. Unfortunately, the fraud part of this is unfortunate. Mm-hmm. So something that's becoming a lot more regular of a thing is this whole emotional support animals, or ESAs, and service animals. And don't get me wrong, they're very important, and people with legitimate needs for those animals, super awesome that we can do that. But there are people who use that as a way to get their pit bull in. And there are things that you definitely can and cannot do, say, or ask for or restrict for on that. Mm-hmm. And I'll tell you what, it's not common sense. And these are all things, if you're doing this on your own, you've got to make sure you understand, because if you come across this, it is so easy to slip up and accidentally push the red button and destroy everything without knowing that you did. And I don't say that to scare people, but I kind of do. Yeah. Because I'm telling you, it's scary. Like even though we've been through tons of training on this and we have our lawyers and we have our processes written down, anytime one of these comes in, it's like, okay, team, let's make sure we get this exactly right. We cannot ad-lib this at all. Like, let's make sure it's by the book, just because it's just such a hot topic you don't want to mess up on.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then there are other things too. I mean, we alluded to some of them around fair housing, but like around protected classes, and all these things are really great things, and I'm so glad we have them, because it's disgusting the stories that you hear about people out there that are discriminating against folks. But that also means that there are, even when you have really good intentions, you can still be breaking the law. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, the government doesn't really care what your intentions were. They just care whether or not you violated the law. Like I'll give you a little teaser right now. For example, on your application criteria, whether you're a DIY investor or professional or whatever, it is against the law to say no one with a criminal record will be allowed to rent our property. Against the law. Whether you like it or not, that might sound crazy, but that's what's called a disparate impact on a potentially protected class. So we'll go into that and why something that sounds that absurd is the way it is. And it kind of makes sense. It'll make sense once we explain it. But yeah, crazy.
It is crazy, but it's true.
It's true. It's true crazy. We'll talk a little bit about pre-qualification. And what types of criteria we use to screen tenants, how to screen, maybe some different companies you can use, and
jumping in.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, screening. You've got, we're going to look at individuals' personal background, personal information. We're going to ID. We're going to verify their identity, of course. Especially, Chris, you mentioned fraud. I mean, there are rampant examples of fraud out there. So we need to make sure, if that's John Smith moving into that property, that is indeed John Smith doing so. We're also going to talk about rental references. That's going to be really important, making sure that we've got good quality tenants to help, going back to what I mentioned before, protecting and preserving that property. You can't do that with crummy tenants, let's be honest. And then just credit checks, criminal record checks, and doing an income/employment check. And I know I'm kind of rushing through these, but we're going to get into them in a greater in more detail in a later podcast anyway.
Yep. All right. Then what? After we're done screening the tenant.
The fun part, move in.
Yay!
Yay. We've done it. We've climbed that mountain. So that's the exciting part when we actually are able to turn the keys over to a tenant. And I'm finding, Chris, in my experience now working here, that is a process. That is an ordeal.
Yeah.
And we want to make sure, of course, that it's going to be a great experience for the tenants. You know, as property managers, our responsibility is always to the property owner, but we also owe the tenant the experience of having a safe, clean, and habitable place to live. We want to make that move-in experience seamless for them.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the way to think about this is there are two ways. There's kind of this spectrum of landlord. And on one end of the spectrum, you have landlords that say, they're just a tenant. What do I care?
Mm-hmm.
And we call those people slumlords. And, if that's how you want to operate your business and that's how you want to treat people, okay, this podcast isn't for you. You should just turn this off now.
Mm-hmm.
On the complete opposite end of the spectrum is someone who is like, hey, I have an opportunity to give someone a safe, comfortable, clean, functional home where they're really proud to call that home and have friends and family over. And I feel like I have a responsibility to do the right thing because of that.
Yeah, I think the misconception out there is those things are mutually exclusive, and they're not. I mean, you can be
right.
You can be a fantastic landlord, a fantastic property owner, taking good care of the property. Your tenants are happy, and yes, you are making money month over month. So you don't have to be one or the other. So
exactly, and I guess the way to kind of look at this is like each of your properties that you own is your own business, and the tenant is your customer. And so I mean, there really is some customer service. And what's kind of goofy about like a professional property management company is we definitely like the homeowner is our client. That's our customer. But the tenant is too. But the tenant's also the homeowner's customer.
Right.
And so when you're doing this on your own, you got to really think about that. Like, this is my customer. And it's weird because you have to enforce boundaries and rules with your customer, but you also have to remember that they're the ones paying you. And so there are some things that you can do around the move-in process. And that's why, we're going to spend some time on this because like you said, Jesse, like it's really important folks get set off on the right foot.
Chris, you make a great point right there on our little flow chart, beginning with the end in mind, move out. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, no. So the whole idea is, hey, at some point this tenant's going to move out, right? And what we know is that some tenants are going to push back pretty hard on that move out about charges or things. Hey, it wasn't like that it was like that when I moved in. Well, there's no picture of it. Yeah, well, I didn't think you were going to be so anal retentive to like charge me for that. And so I guess, what you want to think about when you're moving folks in is you want to think about like, what is the move out going to look like and how am I going to do that? And how can I set myself up for success during the move in process? So that goes back to like just making sure, whatever you're doing for evaluations, like how we do it. And we think about that is we do a very thorough move out inspection. And then we also do a thorough move in. And one of the ways we do that is we do that on the same digital platform so that when we give the tenant the move out inspection, it actually shows them the side-by-side, like in detail, move in, here are all the things with this room and all the high-res photos and the condition coding, color coded and all that of walls and floors and ceiling and fans and plugins and all that. And then here's all the move out. And like the other day we had one that was 155 pages long of high res photos. And it was like, complain about like, I dare you, like come back and say it wasn't like that, like we've got it. So it's just thinking about that. Like you're probably not going to have that as a DIY investor, but just kind of keeping that idea. And then how are you going to set up your tenants for success? Like this is where you kind of communicate expectations around maintenance, how they get a hold of you, how are they going to pay rent, setting expectations about like timely payment of rent, that kind of thing. How are you going to do inspections? Why do you do those inspections? Kind of like we talked about before. And how do you get the move-in inspection done? Like, let's be honest, again, I'll go back to the lazy landlord. This is a really easy area to not do something that's really important.
Absolutely.
Because at the time, like the move-in inspection itself, at move-in, it's important, but probably if something's wrong with the property, the tenant's going to tell you anyway.
Right.
Where it really comes to bite you is the move out.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is like an area where procrastination is not your friend. All right. So, and then what do you do with the inspection now that you've got it? We'll talk about that. And then tips for keeping up on the property and setting those expectations.
Chris, I think going back to what we were just mentioning, in terms of having tenants and landlords that care from a property management standpoint, if you're communicating with the tenants, if you have a good relationship and a good rapport with them, if you're treating them like human beings, it's going to come back. They want to work with you. Individuals would always prefer to work with you versus against you. That's just human nature. So if you're communicating properly and treating that tenant with respect, it's gonna benefit you in the end.
Full-heartedly agree. All right, what's next, Jesse?
Rent collection. This is the less fun part. Well, it's great as a landlord, obviously, and a property manager, but trying to actually chase down individuals for money, that's never exactly fun.
Yeah. And with this too, I would kind of say like, this is like the ongoing business as usual, like rent collection, lease enforcement, and unfortunately, like depending on how well you did some of the other things on this list, evictions.
Right.
And those are all a necessary part of managing your property. So we're going to talk a little bit about how to collect rent, right?
Absolutely. What happens if someone pays late?
Yep. And what elements of the lease should you really be paying attention to and enforcing? Like that sounds kind of goofy maybe, but there are some elements of the lease like you just want to make sure you set really solid boundaries on. And there are other elements that you can kind of go, it's there because it needs to be just in case, but like we don't need to nitpick over that one. That might sound a little counterintuitive. Notice what we did not put on this list is we didn't put writing the lease on this list. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One, we're not attorneys, so we use leases that are super duper robust that attorneys have written for us. It's a little bit self-explanatory too. I mean, so I prefer really not to go into that too much, but it is important to have a solid lease set up that you can enforce that
Right.
clearly outlines everything. And, here in North Carolina, at least, and we might have folks listening from all over here in North Carolina, we have a really, really robust standard lease from the North Carolina Realtor Association. I've had multiple attorneys come to me with their own that want us to manage their property, and they're not real estate attorneys, and they're like, I want to use my own lease. And I'm like, all right, well, send it over to me. Let me look at it. And I'm like, where's your clause for this, and that? And they're like, why do I need that? I'm like, cause you do.
Yeah.
You don't need it until you need it.
Yeah.
Anyway, so we'll kind of go through that. And then what happens if someone, well, you already said this, what happens if someone pays late? What's the process for that timeline? How do you communicate that? What are the laws in North Carolina too? Mm-hmm. That'll be really important. And then, what do you do with other types of lease violations other than non-payment of rent? Because that's typically what we get. Like most single-family homes are in an HOA, and so sometimes folks don't exactly mow their lawn, or they leave a trash can out on the curb too long, or whatever. So how do you handle that? What's the process you put in place? How much grace do you give people? That kind of thing.
Absolutely.
All right. What else are we talking about in the next few weeks?
Well, the routine walkthrough, making sure the tenant is understanding first and foremost, what we're doing, why we're doing this, and just giving them an opportunity to talk through any objections that they might have, because we're going to be entering their home for this. I mean, at that point in time, this is a leased property. That's their home.
Yep.
So we want to make sure they understand exactly the benefit to both them and, of course, the property owner.
Awesome. Yep. Perfect. We'll talk a little bit about how to document those, how they can be used, and maybe some tools and things that are
absolutely
out there too.
I think if people aren't already picking up on this trend, a lot of these things build upon one another in property management. So that's a theme you're going to be recognizing as we move forward through these next few weeks in podcasts.
Yeah. And I promise too, like, especially this next one, my wife is going to kill me when I say this because she's an accountant, but a lot of these things we look at and I'm just like, oh man, that sounds so boring, but we're going to do our best to not make them boring and make them like really practical, give you some tips and tricks and things that we've heard over the years, or instances where we've come across crazy stories,
Yep.
and really try to make it valuable to anyone who's listening.
Yeah, and I think the biggest thing too is learn from our successes and learn from our failures, as we've mentioned previously. So we'll talk through all of that.
Exactly. So the accounting piece is super exciting. I'm really hoping we can get on the accounting firm that I use. They specialize in real estate, and what's cool about them is I'm hoping we can share with you a tip how you can literally save thousands of dollars on your tax bill legally by owning real estate. And I will tell you this right now: most of you are probably not doing this. And so, of course, consult with your tax professional.
That's our disclaimer.
Because we are not tax professionals.
No,
but I'm
no.
hoping to get a tax pro on here, and specifically my tax guy, because he's got this cool thing that he does that I'm not going to tell you what it is, because you're going to have to listen for the tip.
Teaser.
But I'm serious when I say, if you've got a $200,000 house, this could save you potentially thousands a year, depending on your personal situation. But really cool to do. Anyway, shameless plug for him too, for any of you who don't have an awesome tax guy. But let's see, and then we'll talk a little bit about like what things with an investment property should you be keeping track of. So what are all the different potential incomes and expense items? What kind of receipts do you need? What do you need to worry about? What don't you? That kind of thing.
And the astute investor is going to ask you these types of questions as a property manager. They want, they'll understand you're not a tax professional, but they want your level of expertise. And of course, at a very high level, we want to provide it for them using Chris's disclaimer, of course, that we are not tax professionals.
Yeah, exactly. And you want to make sure too that you've got, as an investor, that you're, if you're doing this on your own, you want to make sure that you understand where your money's going and how does your property rank compared to the projections that you had for it versus other properties that are out there. And then let's face it, at some point you might get audited, and you want to make sure that you can really back up what you've taken, because one of the biggest advantages of real estate is there's a lot of favorable tax treatment of real estate. Like, this country has set up, I can't remember who it is that talks about this, but there's a Rich Dad guy, the tax guy, Tom Wheelwright, I think. He says, like, I'm totally gonna mess up this quote, but it's like, the first 10 pages of the IRS code are to tell you how to pay taxes. The other umpteen thousand are to tell you how to not pay taxes. And it's true. It's all the exceptions, right?
That is true.
So the government they incentivize folks for doing the things that they want us to do.
Right.
One of those is owning real estate. And that's why there are so many cool little things within the tax code about owning real estate. So hopefully we'll get to expose some of those and help folks capitalize on them a little bit. We'll talk about like what we as management companies track, maybe some different ideas for tools that you can use to track some things. And like we already said, taxes, how to legally not pay them.
Legally.
Legally.
Emphasis on legally.
And we'll try to not offend any accountants in the process. All right, cool. And then what?
Preventative maintenance. You have an investment property, you are going to be spending money to upkeep that property, but we want to help find ways to minimize it, minimize your expenses. That also covers, potential remodels in between tenants, or to help maximize the value of your property. Some people will come in buying a home that has that 1967 avocado green kitchen sink. My grandmother had that. I mean, it was cool. I mean, I see that kitchen sink, I think of my grandmother, but I also don't think of a successful rental property with an avocado green
Not
sink.
something you want to pay top dollar for.
No. And then, of course, maintenance emergencies. Things are going to happen. Even the best laid plans, and no matter how much you're trying to prepare, there are going to be maintenance emergencies. So we're going to get into, the meat and potatoes of how to handle that.
Yeah, like, when I was, luckily, knock on wood, when I was an investor, I never had, I had, okay, hot water heater went out, whatever. That's an emergency, but it's not like, oh my gosh, what do I do now? But again, back to managing so many different properties and so many different types of properties, like what happens at 11:30 on a Saturday night when you get the phone call saying there's literally water rushing in through my ceiling or from underneath my floor from the person next door? Like, what do you do in that scenario? And I'll tell you what, as a DIY investor, you better have a plan for that.
Yep.
And the plan better not be, well, let my phone ring because I forgot to delegate my phone to someone else and it's on airplane mode while I'm visiting my sister in Kansas. Because that tenant needs you and you have like a legal responsibility to them.
Right.
And that was always my fear when I was a landlord. I'm like, oh man. So my Europe trip was a great example. we were in the Cinque Terre. I won't forget it. And my wife and I were couple-ish glasses of wine in. And I get this phone call from my tenant and she's like, the next door neighbor is all cracked out and he's trying to kick in my door and the police are here. What do I do? And I'm just like, wow, that's a vacation killer for you. So you're going to get those types of calls. And so we'll kind of go through what some of those might look like and how you handle them. How do you make sure you have certain folks in place, who you need to have on your team and that kind of thing for that.
Right. Preparing for the future, no matter what that looks like, basically.
Yeah, exactly. Very cool. And then, we'll get into like another episode around like lease renewals and negotiations. And how does that work? Like, when should I be doing that? How do I set up my leases for when should they be renewing? Again, maybe we'll touch on marketing a little bit. How you might want to negotiate with tenants. Should I even increase the rent? I get that question a lot. Mm-hmm. Should we just keep rent the same? I really like these people. I don't want them to move. And then how do you even come up with what the rental increase should be?
Mm-hmm. That's a question that comes up all the time.
Yeah. How do you determine that? Do you give them some sort of incentive? What do you market the property? When do you start marketing the property? If they're going to move out, should you market the property while they're still in there? All those things we could talk about. So.
Absolutely.
Cool. What's the last one, Jesse?
Finally, move out. We've made it to lucky number 11. You're right. Not 10, not 12, but 11.
Yeah.
I like it. Move out, security deposit, disposition. So, as Chris mentioned before, this could be a very sticky subject for some tenants, depending upon their personalities, I would say, and what they came in expecting. And I would say, if you set proper expectations at the beginning with individuals in terms of what was going to happen with their security deposit, an if-then kind of scenario. So we're going to talk a little bit about, what to do with the security deposit, how to do this, really what to look out for, and basically staying out of hot water, staying on the right side of things with the tenant and making sure you're not causing any more harm.
Yeah. Awesome. That's it. So, hey, we're really excited to bring you these next few episodes. Super excited about this podcast. Thanks so much for listening. We appreciate it.
Yeah.
And go ahead.
No, we'll, like you said, this was bumpy but fun. It's like just sitting here having a conversation. Like Chris said, we're going to add some color to this. We're going to add a lot of stories. There's definitely a lot that we can tell you about, the pitfalls and the triumphs and the tragedies of all of this. But it's fun, and I'm excited to get going.
Yeah, me too. And so, hey, if you can, make sure you subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss out on any future episodes. Go ahead and leave us a review so that we can share this with other folks if you found this information at all helpful. And check us out. You can send us an email to podcast@sunn.com or check out our show page at investmentpropertygeeksofcharlotte.com. We hope you listen to the next one. We hope you enjoyed this. We hope it was valuable. And with that, I guess, this is Chris and Jesse, and we are wishing you a brighter life through real estate.